I am Nia, 32 years old and a forensic accountant. On Mother's Day, my stepmother Cassandra stood up in front of Atlanta's elite at her $1 million Buckhead mansion to publicly call me a barren disappointment who brought cheap wine. I did not cry or run away. Instead, I smiled, reached into my designer bag, and touched the velvet box that held a forensic audit report guaranteed to send her to federal prison and leave her homeless by sunset. Before I tell you how I dismantled her perfect life, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to serve cold hard karma to a toxic family member. The spring sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the sprawling estate in Buckhead. It was a picture-perfect afternoon in one of Atlanta's most exclusive neighborhoods. The sprawling backyard was filled with catered brunch stations, towering floral arrangements, and the gentle hum of a live jazz quartet. Black excellence was on full display. There were judges, surgeons, and politicians mingling on the manicured lawn, holding crystal flutes of imported champagne. Everyone was dressed in their Sunday best, projecting an image of flawless wealth and unity. But sitting on a plush velvet sofa in the corner of the grand living room, I knew exactly how rotten the foundation of this house truly was. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored navy power suit and took a slow sip of my sparkling water. I was an outsider in my own childhood home, a house my real mother had purchased years before the cancer took her. My father, Marcus, stood by the patio doors laughing loudly with a group of local developers. He wore a custom linen suit and the arrogant smile of a man who believed his own lies. He was a construction contractor who liked to pretend he was a real estate mogul. Beside him was his golden boy, my younger half-brother Jamal. Jamal was 28 and had never worked a hard day in his life, relying entirely on the family bank accounts to fund his luxury cars and expensive habits. Clinging to Jamal's arm was his wife, Chloe. She was a 27-year-old white realtor who constantly overstepped her bounds, using my father's connections to sell properties while treating me like the hired help. Chloe caught my eye from across the room and offered a tight, patronizing smile before whispering something in Jamal's ear that made him smirk. I just looked back at them with absolute calm. Let them enjoy their delusions for a few more minutes. The real star of the afternoon was Cassandra. At 50 years old, my stepmother looked like a reality television star. She wore a stunning emerald green gown, her hair styled to perfection, diamonds glittering on her wrists and neck. She glided through the crowd accepting compliments and gifts with practiced humility. No one here knew that 20 years ago, Cassandra was just the medical assistant hired to care for my dying mother. They did not know how she had manipulated my grieving father and married him a mere 3 months after my mother's funeral. To this crowd, she was the gracious matriarch of a highly successful family. To me, she was a parasite who had spent 2 decades making my life miserable. As the catering staff began clearing the first course, Cassandra moved to the center of the grand living room. She picked up a silver spoon and gently tapped it against her champagne flute. The clear ringing sound cut through the jazz music and the chatter. The room slowly fell silent as dozens of wealthy guests turned their attention to the hostess. Cassandra beamed, her eyes sparkling with artificial warmth. "Thank you all for coming today." Cassandra began, her voice projecting clearly across the vast room. Mother's Day is such a beautiful time to reflect on family, on the bonds that tie us together, and on the legacy we are building. I look around this room, and I am just so overwhelmed with gratitude for the incredible community we have here in Atlanta. The guests murmured their polite agreements and raised their glasses in a silent toast. My father walked over and put a supportive arm around Cassandra's waist, kissing her cheek for the audience. "I am especially thankful for my wonderful husband, Marcus," she continued, placing her hand over his heart, "and for my beautiful son, Jamal, and my sweet daughter-in-law, Chloe, who are doing such an amazing job running the family real estate business. You make me so incredibly proud every single day." Jamal puffed out his chest and Chloe gave a modest little wave to the crowd. Then Cassandra's eyes drifted across the room and locked directly onto me. The artificial warmth in her gaze vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating gleam. I knew exactly what was coming. This was her favorite game, the public humiliation of the stepdaughter who refused to bow to her. "And of course we even have Nia here with us today," Cassandra said. The tone of her voice shifted, becoming dripping with condescending pity. The guests turned to look at me, sitting alone on the sofa. Nia, thank you so much for coming, darling. We know how hard these family events are for you. The room grew uncomfortably quiet. People shifted their weight, sensing the sudden hostility in the air. I know you have always been the difficult one in this family. Cassandra went on, her voice carrying a theatrical sigh. It must be so challenging for you being 32 years old, no husband in sight, no children to celebrate today, just entirely alone. But we still love you, even if you are a constant disappointment to your father's expectations. A few gasps rippled through the crowd. Some of the older women looked away in second-hand embarrassment. My father did not stop her. He just stood there looking mildly annoyed that I was even present to cause this disruption. Chloe covered her mouth to hide a nasty little smile. And sweetie, Cassandra added, holding up a moderately priced bottle of wine I had handed to the butler upon arrival. While we do appreciate you trying to contribute to our beautiful brunch, you really did not need to bring this cheap grocery store wine. We serve only the finest vintage here. But I suppose when you are just a simple accountant, you have to count your pennies. Do not worry, we will give this to the catering staff to take home. Laughter erupted from Jamal, echoing harshly in the tense room. Chloe giggled along with him, leaning into his shoulder. A few of my father's friends chuckled nervously, trying to follow the host's lead. Cassandra stood tall, her chin raised, looking down at me, as if I were dirt on the bottom of her expensive heels. She was waiting for me to break. She was waiting for me to cry, to yell, to run out of the house in shame, just like I used to do when I was a teenager. She wanted to prove to all these important people that I was exactly what she claimed, an unstable, bitter failure of a woman. But I was not that scared little girl anymore. I was a senior forensic accountant who spent my days dismantling money laundering rings and financial fraud for federal investigations. I did not shed a single tear. I did not flush with embarrassment. I sat perfectly still, maintaining direct eye contact with the woman who had stolen my mother's life. I slowly set my glass of sparkling water on the marble coffee table. I picked up my designer handbag from the cushion beside me and unclasped the gold hardware. My hands slipped inside, and my fingers traced the smooth velvet of the small black box I had prepared just for this occasion, the ultimate Mother's Day gift. I stood up. The movement was slow and deliberate. Around me, the polite murmurs and the soft jazz music had completely died out. Everyone was staring, waiting for the dramatic exit they had been promised. My father shifted his weight, his jaw clenching, already formulating the apology he would offer his friends for my behavior. Chloe leaned forward on the plush sofa, her phone subtly angled in her hand, practically vibrating with the hope of catching a viral meltdown on camera to share with her superficial friends. Jamal just smirked, crossing his arms, fully expecting me to run away in tears. I did not run. I smoothed the front of my tailored jacket, locked my eyes onto Cassandra, and smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the exact expression I used when sitting across the table from a corporate embezzler right before handing their files over to federal authorities. The air in the living room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Cassandra faltered for a fraction of a second. Her perfectly sculpted eyebrows twitched. She had spent 2 decades bullying a grieving child, but today she was facing a woman who dissected complex financial crimes and dismantled money laundering rings for a living. I was not intimidated by her emerald gown or her stolen diamonds. I took a measured breath and let my voice carry through the dead silent room. You are absolutely right, Cassandra. It is Mother's Day. A day to honor the women who shaped us, who built the very foundations we stand on, and who left legacies that cannot be erased no matter how hard someone else tries to scrub them away. I took a few slow steps forward, closing the distance between the seating area and the center of the room, where she stood holding her crystal flute. The wealthy guests parted slightly, creating a clear path. I held up the small black velvet box, letting the afternoon sunlight catch its smooth surface. I did not bring that wine for you. I continued, my tone conversational, pleasant, and completely lethal. I brought it for the catering staff because I actually respect the people who work for a living. But I did bring you a gift, a very special one. Cassandra's eyes darted to the box. For a brief second, the sheer greed she had always harbored flashed across her face. She loved expensive things. She loved being given tributes in front of an audience. Chloe stretched her neck from the sofa, trying to see what luxury brand might be stamped on the velvet. My father relaxed slightly, his shoulders dropping mistakenly, believing that I was finally submitting to the family hierarchy. He actually thought I was offering a peace treaty wrapped in velvet to save face in front of his wealthy developer friends. I stopped just a few feet away from my stepmother. I looked at her manicured hands, the expensive rings she bought using money she had absolutely no right to claim, and then I looked directly into her eyes. I spent months thinking about what to get the woman who has everything, I said, keeping my voice dangerously calm. What do you give the woman who moved into this mansion, took over my mother's closets, and assumed my mother's life a mere 3 months after we put her in the ground? My father's face instantly darkened. The wealthy guests exchanged shocked glances. The flawless facade of the happy blended family was cracking in real time right in front of them. Cassandra opened her mouth to speak, her cheeks flushing with indignation, but I did not let her get a single word out. Being a forensic accountant, I deal strictly in facts, I said, raising my voice just enough to ensure every single politician and socialite on that patio heard me clearly. I track ledgers. I trace missing funds. I find the things people try very hard to hide behind shell companies and fake smiles. So I decided to give you something you lost 5 years ago. Something you desperately tried to bury right alongside my mother in Westview Cemetery. I held the velvet box out toward her. Take it, it belongs to you. After all, you are the one who went through so much trouble to make sure it never saw the light of day. Cassandra stared at the small black box. Her confident posture evaporated. Her hands remained frozen at her sides. She knew me well enough to realize this was not a diamond bracelet or a misguided peace offering. This was a trap. But with 50 of Atlanta's most influential people watching her every move, waiting to see what the wealthy matriarch would do next, she had absolutely no choice. Before her trembling fingers could even brush the velvet, my father finally broke his paralysis. He stepped between us. His broad shoulders tensed, his face a mask of barely contained fury. The charming host was gone. Nia, sit down right now, Marcus hissed. His voice dropped to that dangerous, commanding octave he used to control his construction sites, meant to intimidate and silence. You are making a scene in front of my colleagues. Put that away and apologize to your mother immediately. She is not my mother, I replied. My voice remained remarkably steady, my eyes never leaving Cassandra. And I am not making a scene, Marcus. I am making a delivery. Now step aside. Marcus turned a deep shade of purple. He reached out to grab my wrist, a desperate physical attempt to force me back onto the sofa and sweep this unscripted disaster under the rug. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I just looked down at his hand, then up at his furious eyes. I said, step aside, I repeated, lowering my tone so it carried a chilling absolute authority. Unless you want me to explain to the mayor standing over by the mimosa bar exactly why your commercial construction firm has been overbilling the city for the past 3 quarters. Yes, I looked into those municipal accounts too. Marcus froze. His hand hovered in mid-air before slowly dropping to his side. The threat landed perfectly. He prized his public image above all else, and I had just promised to detonate it in front of the very politicians he needed to keep his business afloat. He took a slow, defeated step backward, his eyes wide with the sudden realization that he had completely lost control of the daughter he thought he had broken. I turned my attention back to the woman in the emerald green gown. Open the box, Cassandra. Her hands were shaking violently. Her perfectly manicured French tips trembled so hard that the crystal flute in her left hand rattled dangerously, champagne threatening to spill over the rim and ruin her expensive dress. With agonizing slowness, her right hand reached out and took the small black box from my palm. The tiny gold latch snapped open with a sharp click that somehow echoed across the silent patio. Inside, resting on the white satin cushion, there was no diamond ring. There was no apology note. There was a sleek, encrypted titanium USB drive resting on top of a tightly folded piece of heavy watermarked paper. Cassandra handed her champagne glass to a passing waiter without looking at him. She picked up the folded paper with both hands. As she opened it, the bold black text at the top of the page caught the afternoon light. It read, "Official Forensic Audit Report and Final Asset Tracing." I watched the blood completely drain from Cassandra's face. The arrogant, untouchable matriarch vanished in a single heartbeat. Her flawless makeup suddenly looked like a plastic mask painted over pure, unadulterated terror. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. The paper in her hands trembled so violently, it produced a frantic rustling noise that cut through the quiet air. "What is it?" Chloe demanded, pushing past Jamal and peering over Cassandra's shoulder. Her eyes scanned the document, her brow furrowing, as she tried to make sense of the accounting terminology. "Is it a lawsuit? What does this mean?" "It is a detailed map," I said, projecting my voice so the surrounding guests could catch every single word. A very meticulous court-admissible map tracking exactly how millions of dollars were illegally drained from my biological mother's commercial real estate accounts, while she was heavily medicated on hospice care. It shows the forged power of attorney documents. It shows the offshore shell companies created overnight. And most importantly, it shows Cassandra's signature authorizing every single fraudulent transfer before my mother's body was even cold. A collective gasp rippled through the garden. The jazz quartet abruptly stopped playing, a screeching halt of a cello string cutting through the heavy air. The whispering began instantly. The wealthy socialites, the judges, the developers, everyone who had just raised their glasses to this woman were now leaning in. Their eyes were wide with scandalized hunger. The whispers grew into a loud, undeniable buzz that swept across the manicured lawn like a wildfire. "You are lying," Jamal barked, stepping forward. His chest puffed out in a pathetic display of physical intimidation. He pointed an accusatory finger at me. "You made this garbage up because you are jealous. You have always been jealous of us." "Jealous of what, Jamal?" I fired back, my eyes locking onto him with absolute disdain. "Your leased sports cars, your maxed-out credit cards, or the fact that you rely on stolen money to fund a lifestyle you have never actually earned. You are a 28-year-old boy playing pretend with a stolen inheritance. Sit down before I pull out the audit on your personal accounts next." Jamal clamped his mouth shut, stepping back as if he had been physically struck. Chloe stared at me, her arrogant smirk completely wiped away, replaced by the dawning realization that her lavish lifestyle was entirely built on a crime scene. Cassandra finally found her voice, though it was a desperate, breathless rasp. The commanding hostess from 5 minutes ago was entirely gone. "Nia, please. We can talk about this inside. Just you, me, and your father. We can go to the study and explain everything. It is a misunderstanding." "There is nothing to explain," I replied, taking a step back to fully absorb the picture of her crumbling empire. "You thought you buried my mother and took her kingdom. You thought you erased me from this family because I refused to be a pawn in your little game of pretend. You invited all these people here today to watch you tear me down. You told everyone I was a failure and a disappointment. But the only disappointment here is that you actually thought a forensic accountant would not follow the money." The buzzing of the crowd escalated into outright conversation. Phones were coming out. The very people Cassandra had invited to witness my humiliation were now eagerly documenting hers. Some guests were already edging toward the exits, eager to distance themselves from a massive federal crime. Others stayed rooted to the spot, captivated by the absolute destruction of Atlanta's fake royalty. The Pandora's box was officially open, and the perfect facade of the Buckhead mansion was bleeding out onto the lawn for everyone to see. I stepped away from the velvet sofa and began to pace slowly around the perimeter of the grand brunch table. Every pair of eyes in the garden tracked my movement. The heavy silence was broken only by the rhythmic clicking of my heels against the imported stone patio. I let the tension build for a moment before I spoke again, ensuring my voice carried the crisp, undeniable ring of absolute truth. "Let us take a walk down memory lane," I said, my gaze sweeping across the faces of the politicians and business moguls who had just been drinking Cassandra's champagne. Most of you know Cassandra as the elegant hostess, the charitable socialite, the woman who supposedly built this family empire alongside my father. But how many of you actually know what she was doing exactly 5 years and 3 months ago? I stopped right behind Cassandra's chair. She stiffened, refusing to turn around, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the edge of the table. She was wearing pale blue scrubs. I continued projecting my voice so it bounced off the walls of the mansion. She was not sipping vintage wine at country clubs. She was a hospice care assistant making $20 an hour. My mother, the actual architect of the family wealth, was dying of stage 4 pancreatic cancer. And Cassandra was the woman hired to change her bedpans and administer her morphine drops. Murmurs erupted again. A prominent judge sitting near the ice sculpture put his glass down, suddenly looking very uncomfortable. People began to shift on their feet, the glamorous illusion shattering with every word I spoke. My mother built a real estate portfolio from the ground up, I said, resuming my slow, relentless walk around the table, forcing my father to finally meet my eye. She owned 5 of the most lucrative commercial districts in downtown Atlanta. Warehouses, retail spaces, bustling properties that generated massive, consistent revenue. It was a kingdom built on decades of relentless hard work, sweat, and unmatched business acumen. And Cassandra, sitting by her bedside, realized she had stumbled into a gold mine. She did not just administer medicine, she administered a calculated predatory plan. I pointed a finger directly at my father. He looked like a man standing on a trapdoor. Marcus here was drowning, I said, stripping away his pride piece by piece. His construction company was hemorrhaging money. He was leveraged to the hilt, desperate to maintain the illusion of success. Cassandra saw a weak, financially desperate man and a dying woman with millions in assets. She knew exactly what to do. She increased my mother's pain medication dosage to keep her disoriented. Then she brought in her own shady notary to forge power of attorney documents. She systematically isolated my mother from her own lawyers, from her accountants, and most importantly from me. Cassandra finally spun around, her voice a shrill, panicked screech. "You cannot prove any of that. It is slander. Marcus, call security. Get her out of here right now." "Call them," I challenged, holding my ground without blinking. "Please, Marcus, call the police. Let us hand them the toxicology reports I subpoenaed. Let us show them the timeline of the forged signatures compared to my mother's medical charts." The ink was barely dry on my mother's death certificate before Cassandra moved into the master bedroom. 90 days. That is all it took. 3 months after we lowered the woman who built this entire empire into the ground. Marcus put a ring on the hospice nurse's finger. And just like that, the medical assistant became a millionaire. I watched the sickening realization wash over the guests. The timeline was horrifying, and the sheer audacity of it left them completely speechless. They were looking at Cassandra not with admiration, but with absolute disgust. The glamorous green gown suddenly looked like a costume draped over a scavenger. "You did not build a single thing in your life, Cassandra," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register as I stopped directly in front of her again. "You hijacked a legacy. You took 5 commercial properties that were meant to be held in trust for me, and you liquidated the assets to fund this mansion, these parties, and your pathetic attempts to buy your way into Atlanta high society. You paraded around in my mother's jewelry, sleeping in her bed, spending her money, all while looking me in the eye and calling me a failure." I took a step closer, crowding her space, letting the sheer weight of my presence bear down on her. "You thought because I was grieving because I was young, that I would just walk away and let you have it. You thought I was weak. But I spent the last 5 years tracking every single wire transfer, every offshore account, every fraudulent deed transfer you and your little accomplices pushed through the county clerk's office. Let us talk about those 5 commercial districts," I said, pacing again, making sure everyone heard the exact financial breakdown. The Midtown retail complex, the logistics warehouses on the south side, properties that were generating steady, clean revenue. You could not just leave them alone. You had to funnel the money out because Marcus had creditors breathing down his neck. You used my mother's stolen legacy to bail out a failing construction firm. You committed federal wire fraud, tax evasion, and elder abuse, all wrapped into one neat little package. And you did it while smiling at my mother's funeral wearing a black dress paid for with her stolen funds. Marcus stepped forward again, his voice trembling, completely stripped of all its former booming authority. "Nia, please. You do not understand the pressure I was under. The business was failing. I had to protect our livelihood. Cassandra helped me save the company. We did what we had to do for the family. For the family, I echoed, letting out a sharp, humorless laugh. You stole from your own daughter to save your fragile ego, Marcus. You let a predator drug your dying wife so you could avoid declaring bankruptcy. You traded your soul and your daughter for a financial bailout. And you have the nerve to stand there and call it protecting the family. You are nothing but a coward in a custom suit. Cassandra was hyperventilating now, clutching her chest, as if she could not get enough air. The guests were completely silent, trapped in the gravitational pull of the destruction happening before them. The jazz musicians had quietly packed their instruments and slipped out the back gate. The catering staff stood frozen, watching the mighty fall from grace. I watched you both. I continued, my voice echoing off the stone walls of the mansion. I watched you tear down everything my mother built. I watched you redecorate this house to erase any trace of her existence. And every single time you mocked my career, every time you called me a disappointment, I went back to my office and dug deeper. I worked 80-hour weeks. I built a network of federal investigators. I became the very thing you should have feared the most. A woman with nothing left to lose and the exact skill set required to take everything from you. I looked at the guests, addressing the remaining crowd directly. If any of you have done business with Marcus or Cassandra in the past 5 years, I highly suggest you call your own legal counsel tomorrow morning. Because the money they used to invest in your projects is dirty. The foundations of their wealth are built on an active crime scene, and the federal government is going to claw back every single dime. Panic rippled through the developers and politicians. Several of them instantly turned their backs on my father, physically distancing themselves from a sinking ship. The social isolation was immediate, absolute, and brutal. You are a monster. Cassandra gasped out, tears finally spilling over her heavy mascara, leaving dark, ugly streaks down her cheeks. You came here to destroy us. No, I corrected her, my expression completely blank. You destroyed yourselves the moment you decided to steal from a dying woman. I am just the auditor who finally came to collect the debt. The silence that followed my declaration was absolute. The garden felt entirely frozen, as if the oxygen had been sucked right out of the buckhead air. But then the sharp scrape of a chair leg against the stone patio broke the spell. I shifted my gaze slightly. Looking over my own shoulder, I watched Chloe stand up. She smoothed the front of her expensive silk designer dress, a piece of clothing undoubtedly bought with my mother's stolen money, and marched forward to stand beside her trembling mother-in-law. Jamal trailed half a step behind her, letting his wife take the front line while he cowardly hid in her shadow. Chloe tossed her blonde hair over her shoulder and glared at me with a look of absolute, unadulterated condescension. She looked at me not just as a disruptive guest, but as an inferior being who had dared to step onto her pristine lawn and ruin her perfect aesthetic. Are you quite finished with this pathetic little performance? Chloe asked, her voice dripping with the kind of entitled arrogance that only comes from someone who has never been told no in her entire life. You march in here uninvited, throwing around ridiculous accusations just to ruin a beautiful afternoon. It is honestly embarrassing, Nia. It is embarrassing for you. I slowly turned my body to fully face her. I did not say a word. I just let her talk. I let her dig the hole as deep as she possibly could. You think you can come here and intimidate us with a bunch of fake spreadsheets and loud threats? Chloe continued, gesturing dismissively toward the velvet box resting on the table. Cassandra is a saint. She stepped up and held this family together when your mother passed away. She took care of Marcus. She welcomed me into this house with open arms. And what did you do? You ran away because you could not handle the fact that the world did not revolve around you anymore. Chloe took another step forward, emboldened by my absolute silence. She planted her hands firmly on her hips, leaning in as if she were scolding a misbehaving child who had tracked mud onto her expensive imported rugs. We all know what this is really about, she sneered, her voice echoing across the courtyard, for all the lingering guests to hear. This is about pure, bitter jealousy. You are sitting in some dreary cubicle crunching numbers for a paycheck, while Jamal and I are actually out here running a massive real estate empire. We are the ones doing the real work. We are the ones networking at the country club, rubbing shoulders with the elite, and closing multi-million-dollar deals every single week. Jamal nodded vigorously behind her, finally finding a scrap of false courage. Tell her, babe, he muttered, pointing a trembling finger at me. She is just mad she got cut out of the profits. She has been hating on us since day one. Chloe smirked, her eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction. She was entirely convinced she was winning the argument. She looked around at the guests who had not yet fled the property, playing directly to the audience, trying to spin a narrative that painted me as a deranged, jealous spinster. Your mother's properties were a mismanaged disaster before we took over, Chloe declared proudly, taking credit for an empire she had ruthlessly stolen. The commercial districts were outdated. The tenant leases were an absolute joke. It took my real estate expertise and Jamal's vision to actually modernize the portfolio. I am the licensed broker who brought real high-end investors to the table. I rebranded the entire operation from the ground up. We turned those dusty old warehouses into premium retail spaces. We built this wealth, Nia. Not you. And certainly not your dead mother. I felt a dangerous, icy calm wash over my entire body. Hearing this woman disrespect my mother's legacy, claiming my mother's relentless hard work and unmatched business acumen as her own, was the exact catalyst I needed. I could feel my heart beating in a slow, steady rhythm. I maintained my professional composure. I let Chloe keep spinning her web of delusion, knowing exactly what was waiting for her in my briefcase. So do not stand there and lecture us about theft. Chloe continued, her voice rising in a triumphant crescendo. Every single transaction, every deed transfer, every lease agreement has been handled perfectly under my real estate license. We are running a legitimate, highly successful corporation. You are just a sad, lonely woman who cannot stand the fact that your little brother and his beautiful wife are wildly successful, while you have absolutely nothing to show for your miserable life. She crossed her arms, giving me a look of profound pity that made my stomach churn. She was playing the role of the superior educated businesswoman who was graciously dealing with an erratic relative. You can try to scare Cassandra and Marcus with your little accounting tricks, Chloe concluded, shaking her head slowly. But you do not scare me. I know the law. I know commercial real estate inside and out. And I know for an absolute fact that you have absolutely no legal ground to stand on. So I suggest you pick up your little velvet box, walk out the front gate, and go back to your empty apartment before I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing and harassment. Chloe let out a heavy huff of breath, looking around the patio as if expecting a round of applause for her brilliant defense. She truly believed she had just put me in my place. She thought her privilege, her real estate license, and her aggressive confidence would be enough to make the scary auditor back down and run away. She thought she was the smartest person in the room, the ultimate mastermind, who had successfully secured her place in Atlanta's high society. I just stared at her. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. I let her bask in her false victory for 5 full seconds. I let her feel the rush of power. I let Jamal puff his chest out, completely oblivious to the absolute massacre that was about to take place on that patio. I tilted my head slightly, studying her face, examining the smug, self-satisfied curve of her lips. I took a slow, deliberate breath. My eyes locked onto hers, stripping away every ounce of her fabricated authority. Are you quite sure you want to be the one doing the talking right now, Chloe? I asked. My voice did not rise. It dropped, turning into a lethal, razor-sharp whisper that commanded absolute attention. Because if I were you, I would be exercising my right to remain silent. But since you decided to stand up and proudly claim responsibility for the rebranding and the management of those properties, let us examine exactly what your supposed expertise entails. I took a slow, deliberate step toward her. Chloe held her ground for a fraction of a second before her instincts betrayed her, and she took a tiny, involuntary step backward. You claim you modernized the portfolio. I continued, my words cutting through the garden like shards of glass. You claim you brought in high-end investors and executed multi-million-dollar deals. Let me tell you what my forensic software found when I ran the tax identification numbers of your premium investors. They do not exist. You did not secure luxury retail tenants. You created 23 phantom limited liability companies registered to a single virtual mailbox in Delaware. Chloe's jaw tightened, but a flicker of genuine panic darted across her eyes. She opened her mouth to interrupt, but I did not give her a single inch of breathing room. A legitimate real estate broker analyzes market value. I said, maintaining a relentless, steady rhythm. A legitimate broker ensures clean title transfers and operates within the bounds of fiduciary duty. You, on the other hand, orchestrated a fire sale of prime Atlanta commercial real estate. You arranged for my mother's most profitable properties to be sold to your own shell companies at 40% below market value. You appraised the Midtown retail complex yourself, deliberately undervaluing the asset, so Cassandra could authorize the transfer without triggering an automatic federal tax audit. I kept my eyes locked onto hers, watching the false bravado drain from her face. You thought you were being incredibly clever, I told her. You thought shuffling the deeds through 3 different holding companies would wash the scent off the money. You thought layering the transactions with dummy corporate officers would insulate you from the fallout. But you made the classic mistake of every arrogant amateur who thinks they can outsmart a forensic auditor. You left a digital paper trail a mile wide, and you tied every single fraudulent transaction directly to your own real estate brokerage account to collect the commission. That is a lie, Chloe stammered. Though her voice had lost all of its previous volume and confidence, I followed all standard procedures. My broker approved every listing. Your broker is currently cooperating with federal authorities to secure an immunity deal. I fired back instantly. He threw you under the bus the second the investigators showed him the heavily redacted escrow accounts. He knows exactly what you did, Chloe. And more importantly, the state knows what you did. I let that sink in. The silence on the patio was deafening. Even Jamal had completely stopped moving, staring at his wife with a look of dawning horror. Let us talk about your real estate license, I said, my tone dripping with absolute disdain. That little piece of paper you love to wave around at the country club. The credential you think separates you from the people who actually work for a living. Do you have any idea how the Georgia Real Estate Commission handles brokers who facilitate the fraudulent transfer of assets from a medically incapacitated owner? Chloe swallowed hard. Her throat bobbed and she looked desperately toward Cassandra for backup, but Cassandra was staring at the ground, hyperventilating. Title 43, Chapter 40 of the Georgia Code. I recited effortlessly, letting my professional expertise completely crush her amateur hour schemes. You are not just looking at a simple license suspension, Chloe. The moment I handed over the ledger showing your commission kickbacks, the commission opened a full-scale investigation into every single property you have touched in the last 4 years. Your license is currently under active investigation, and the board has already drafted the revocation order. No, Chloe whispered, shaking her head. Her perfectly styled blonde hair fell across her face, making her look disheveled and frantic. No, they cannot do that. I am a top producer. I have lawyers. Your lawyers are going to drop you the moment they see the discovery file, I assured her. Because the commission did not just stop at a license revocation. When they realized your little rebranding project involved funneling stolen assets across state lines to avoid capital gains taxes, they handed their entire file directly over to the district attorney. You crossed the line from poor ethical judgment straight into federal wire fraud and money laundering. I watched her breathe in shallow, rapid gasps. The reality of her situation was finally crashing down on her. She had built her entire identity on being the successful, wealthy, untouchable real estate broker who had married into a rich black family. She had loved looking down on me, the biological daughter, because she thought she had outsmarted the system. You walked into this family and saw a gold mine, I told her, my voice echoing with righteous anger. You saw my father, a man so desperate to project wealth, he would ignore the crimes happening under his own roof. You saw Cassandra, a woman greedy enough to sign anything you put in front of her as long as it funded her shopping sprees. And you thought you were the mastermind. You thought your privilege and a shiny real estate badge made you untouchable in this city. I took one final dominant step forward, forcing her to look up at me. You called me a sad, lonely woman who crunches numbers for a paycheck, I said, throwing her earlier insult right back in her face. Well, those numbers just indicted you. You wanted to play in the big leagues of commercial real estate. You wanted to act like a mogul. Now you get to face the consequences like one. The investigation is active, Chloe. The subpoenas have already been drafted. Your entire career is over and your freedom is hanging by a very thin, very fragile thread. Chloe stumbled backward, her designer heels catching on the uneven edge of the stone patio. She grabbed Jamal's arm to steady herself, but Jamal instinctively pulled away, treating his wife like she was suddenly radioactive. The isolation was immediate. The wealthy guests who had been admiring her success just 20 minutes ago were now staring at her with unabashed disgust. She was no longer the golden daughter-in-law. She was a liability, a criminal suspect, and a woman who had just been publicly decimated by the very person she had tried to humiliate. For a full 10 seconds, the entire estate was completely motionless. Not a single person spoke. Not a single crystal glass clinked. The warm Atlanta breeze seemed to die down, leaving the world entirely still. I stood perfectly motionless, anchoring my feet to the stone patio, letting the absolute silence press down on Chloe until the weight of her own guilt threatened to snap her in half. I did not blink. I just watched her unravel. Then, with agonizing slowness, I unzipped the side compartment of my leather portfolio. The crisp, sharp sound of the metal zipper echoed like a gunshot across the quiet garden. I reached inside and withdrew a thick stack of legal documents bound by a heavy black clip. I did not toss them. I did not wave them around. I held them up with the utmost care, letting the bright afternoon sun illuminate the bright blue notary stamps pressed onto the heavy white paper. "Let us talk about October 14th, 4 years ago," I said, resuming my slow, deliberate pace around the patio. My voice was calm, conversational, yet laced with a toxicity that made the remaining guests hold their breath. It was a Tuesday. A rather rainy Tuesday, if my memory serves me correctly. I stopped directly in front of Chloe. She looked like she wanted the earth to open up and swallow her whole. Her hands were shaking so badly that she had to clutch her designer clutch against her stomach just to hide the tremors. On that specific Tuesday, I continued holding up the first document. A warranty deed was filed with the Fulton County Clerk's Office. It authorized the transfer of the West Side Logistics Hub, the absolute crown jewel of my mother's commercial portfolio, to a newly minted company called Peachtree Holdings LLC, a company that, according to the state registry, had been incorporated exactly 24 hours prior to this massive transaction. I looked down at the paper, then back up to her terrified eyes. "And right here on the broker authorization line is your signature, Chloe, in crisp black ink." Chloe swallowed hard. Her face had drained of all color, leaving her looking sickly and pale. I I just processed the paperwork," she stammered, her voice cracking high and thin. It sounded like the whine of a cornered animal. "Cassandra gave me the file. She said it was a standard internal transfer for tax purposes. I did not know." "You did not know," I repeated, tilting my head slightly, as if considering her pathetic excuse. "You are a licensed real estate professional, handling a multi-million-dollar commercial asset transfer, and you expect the federal government to believe you simply did not know. But let us pretend for a moment that you were just dangerously incompetent instead of criminally malicious. Let us pretend you just blindly signed whatever Cassandra put in front of you." I flipped to the second page of the document stack, revealing a highly detailed medical chart. "That excuse might have saved you from prison," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "If it were not for the seller's signature on page 4, the signature you personally notarized, using a stamp you borrowed from a paralegal in your brokerage firm." Chloe's eyes widened in sheer panic. She opened her mouth, but her vocal cords completely failed her. She looked wildly at Jamal, begging him to intervene, but her husband was staring at the ground, sweating profusely, terrified of catching my attention. "You notarized a document claiming you witnessed my mother sign this deed on October 14th, I stated, laying the medical chart directly on top of the deed so everyone could see the matching dates. "But here's the problem with your timeline, Chloe. According to these subpoenaed hospice records from Emory University Hospital, on October 14th, my mother was in a medically induced coma. Her organs were shutting down. She lacked all basic motor function." I took a step closer, invading her personal space, forcing her to look at the undeniable proof of her felony. "It was physically, medically, and biologically impossible for my mother to hold a pen," I said, pronouncing every single syllable with crushing clarity. "Let alone sign a legally binding commercial real estate transfer with the flawless, sweeping, perfectly steady cursive you placed on this line." I held the paper out to her. She refused to take it, her hands glued to her sides. so I simply let go, allowing the forged deed to flutter to the ground and land right on top of her expensive designer shoes. I I did not sign her name. Chloe sobbed, tears finally spilling over her lashes, ruining her perfect makeup. I swear to you, Nia. Cassandra brought me the paper already signed. She said my mother signed it the week before. I just stamped it. I just wanted to help the family. Ignorance is not a defense in federal court, I reminded her coldly. Especially not when the commission check of $250,000 cleared into your personal checking account exactly 3 days after the transfer was finalized. You did not just stamp a piece of paper, Chloe. You actively participated in the theft of a dying woman's legacy, and you took a massive cut of the profits to buy yourself that ridiculous sports car you love to flaunt around town. Chloe collapsed. Her knees simply gave out. She sank down onto one of the plush patio chairs, burying her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. The arrogant, wealthy, untouchable real estate broker, who had stood up just moments ago to put me in my place, was completely gone. In her place sat a broken, terrified criminal who knew she was going to lose everything: her license, her reputation, her wealth, and her freedom. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for her. She had willingly stepped into my mother's house, slept under a roof paid for with stolen money, and looked me in the eye for years with absolute disdain. She had made her bed with thieves, and now she was going to burn with them. I stepped over the documents scattered on the stone floor, completely dismissing her existence. Chloe was done. She was neutralized, removed from the battlefield entirely. She would not speak another word of defiance for the rest of the afternoon. I turned my attention away from the sobbing mess in the patio chair and slowly shifted my gaze. I looked past Cassandra, who was still hyperventilating near the head of the table, and locked my eyes onto the one person who had been trying to hide this entire time. My little brother Jamal. The golden boy. The pampered prince who had stood by and laughed while his wife and his stepmother stripped my inheritance down to the studs. He swallowed hard, taking a desperate step backward as he realized he was next in line. The realization lasted only a fraction of a second before his fragile masculine pride completely overrode his cowardice. He looked down at his wife, who was currently reduced to a weeping puddle on the patio furniture, and then he looked at the whispering crowd of Atlanta elites. The politicians, the developers, and the socialites who usually patted his back and called him a young mogul were now staring at him with absolute disgust. The intense pressure snapped something fundamental inside his pampered brain. He could not stand there and be exposed as a fraud in front of the very people he had spent years trying to impress. He lunged. It was not a calculated or strategic move. It was the clumsy, desperate charge of a spoiled child throwing a violent tantrum because someone was finally taking away his stolen toys. He reached out with both hands, his fingers grasping wildly for the leather portfolio tucked securely under my arm. He intended to snatch the damning evidence, rip the documents to shreds, and somehow destroy the truth right there on the stone patio. I did not flinch. I had anticipated physical aggression the moment I stepped onto the property. I simply pivoted on my heel, shifting my weight and stepping smoothly to the left. Jamal's momentum carried him forward, his hands grasping nothing but empty air. He stumbled awkwardly, his expensive loafers skidding on the smooth stone, and he nearly crashed headfirst into the catering table before catching himself against a massive ice sculpture. The sculpture wobbled dangerously, sending a shower of melting ice water onto his custom-tailored linen suit. "I highly suggest you think very carefully about your next movement, Jamal," I said. My voice sliced through the chaotic murmurs of the crowd like a surgical scalpel. Attempted destruction of evidence is a federal offense, and laying a single finger on me constitutes assault and battery. I already have you dead to rights on massive financial crimes. Do not add violent felonies to your rapidly growing list of indictments. He spun around his chest, heaving, his face contorted with unadulterated rage. He pointed a shaking, aggressive finger at me, trying desperately to muster the booming, intimidating authority our father used to command. Instead, he just sounded like a panicked, cornered boy. "Give me those files," Nia, Jamal shouted, taking another threatening step in my direction. "You are making a massive mistake. You cannot just march into my house, threaten my wife, and spout these insane lies. Give me the papers right now before I make you regret ever showing your face here." "Your house!" I repeated, letting out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed across the tense garden. "You honestly believe this is your house? You really have convinced yourself that you are the king of this little castle, have you not? Let us talk about your kingdom, little brother. Let us talk about the vast real estate empire you supposedly run with such brilliant expertise. Marcus stepped forward, raising his hands in a frantic attempt to stop the collision. Jamal, stand down, Marcus barked, his voice laced with genuine panic. Do not touch her. Let me handle this. But Jamal was too far gone, blinded by his own shattered ego. He shoved our father's arm away, refusing to stand down. I am the vice president of acquisitions, Jamal declared, puffing his chest out and addressing the crowd as much as he was addressing me. I handle the networking. I secure the luxury investors. I earn my salary, and I will not let my bitter estranged sister ruin my reputation with a pile of fabricated spreadsheets. You do not even know what the word acquisitions means, I countered smoothly, completely unbothered by his aggressive posturing. I audited your corporate email server, Jamal. I bypassed your pathetic passwords and read every single message you have sent for the past 4 years. Do you want to know what I found? In the past 36 months, you have not sent a single email containing a term sheet, a letter of intent, or a property valuation. Your entire outbox consists of reservations for VIP tables at nightclubs, inquiries for luxury watch dealers, and invoices for private jet charters to Miami. You do not acquire commercial real estate. You acquire hangovers and massive credit card debt. Jamal's face flushed a deep, mottled red. The guests began to whisper even louder, the sheer humiliation of his exposure hanging heavy in the air. While Chloe was busy forging notary stamps and Cassandra was manipulating my mother's medical charts, what exactly were your contributions to this massive criminal conspiracy? I asked, closing the distance between us until I was standing well within his personal space. I will tell you. You were the designated spender. You were the black hole where my mother's hard-earned legacy went to die. Did you really think no one would notice the sudden, inexplicable influx of cash into your personal checking accounts? Did you honestly think the IRS just ignores a 28-year-old with no legitimate W-2 income suddenly purchasing a Lamborghini outright in cash? I bought that car with my consulting bonuses, Jamal stammered. Though his voice lacked any real conviction, he was rapidly running out of lies to tell. You paid yourself a consulting fee of $400,000 last year from the operating budget of the Midtown retail complex, I stated, quoting the exact numbers from memory, letting the precision of my audit completely crush his defense. A property you have not visited a single time in over 3 years. I pulled the security logs for the building, Jamal. Your keycard has not swiped into that facility since the day you and Chloe stole the deed from my mother's trust. I'll build a stolen company for phantom consulting hours, just so you could buy a sports car and pretend to be a self-made millionaire on social media. He took another aggressive step forward, his fists balled tightly at his sides. The veins in his neck were bulging. He was utterly humiliated, stripped of the fake mogul persona he had painstakingly crafted for his country club friends. Shut your mouth! He spat, his voice dropping to a guttural growl as he leaned down, trying to use his height to intimidate me. You do not know anything about me. You are just a bitter, lonely woman who could not cut it in this family, so you ran away. And now you come back trying to act tough. I am not afraid of your fake documents or your empty threats. I will throw you out of this gate myself. He raised his arm, preparing to grab my shoulder and physically force me off the patio. The crowd gasped. Chloe shrieked his name, suddenly terrified that her husband was about to commit assault in front of 50 witnesses. Marcus lunged forward again, shouting for Jamal to stop, but he was too slow to intervene. I did not retreat. I raised my chin, locking my gaze directly onto his frantic, bloodshot eyes, and I did not yield a single inch of ground. Try it. I dared him, my voice, devoid of any emotion, cold and impenetrable as steel. Take one more step toward me. Jamal, raise your hand, touch my jacket. Give me the exact excuse I need to call the Fulton County Police Department and have you dragged out of this garden in handcuffs in front of every single one of your wealthy friends. Go ahead. Show everyone here exactly what kind of man you are when your stolen money cannot protect you. Jamal froze. His hand hovered just inches from my shoulder, trembling with impotent rage. He looked at my face, searching for any sign of fear, any hint that I was bluffing. He found absolutely nothing. I was a brick wall, and he was finally realizing that he did not have the strength or the intelligence to break me down. You watched Cassandra and Chloe do all the dirty work, I continued, my voice dropping lower meant only for him and the immediate circle of people standing nearby. You let your own wife risk federal prison to funnel money into your joint accounts because you were too incompetent to actually run a business yourself. You claim to be this powerful man, the golden child who was supposed to carry on the family name, but you are nothing but a dependent. You are a parasite feeding off the crimes of the women around you. You are weak, Jamal. You always have been. The truth hit him like a physical blow. He slowly lowered his arm, his fingers uncurling. The aggressive energy completely drained out of his body, leaving him looking hollow and defeated. He glanced around the patio, seeking support from his father, from his friends, from anyone who would validate his existence. But the guests were looking at him with pity and scorn. They saw him exactly for what he was, a spoiled, complicit child who had happily lived off the proceeds of his dying stepmother's stolen estate. Jamal stumbled backward, mirroring the exact same retreat Chloe had made just moments prior. He bumped into a chair and practically collapsed against it, completely immobilized by the reality of his impending destruction. I watched him fold into himself, entirely neutralized, before I slowly adjusted the lapels of my suit and turned my attention away from the broken boy. 2 down. The accomplices were handled. Now it was time to address the true architects of this tragedy. With Jamal broken against the patio chair, I turned my attention away from the collateral damage. I smoothed the front of my tailored jacket, my movements fluid and measured, and stepped around the shattered remnants of my brother's dignity. My gaze locked entirely onto Cassandra. She was no longer hyperventilating or putting on a theatrical display of victimhood. Instead, she was staring at me with the cornered, desperate look of a predator that suddenly realized it was the prey. "You really thought you were a ghost," I said. My voice was no longer a shout. It was a smooth, chilling hum that commanded absolute silence across the manicured lawn. "You thought laundering millions of dollars through offshore accounts and Delaware shell companies would make you invisible. You paid off the right notary. You manipulated a financially desperate husband. You built a massive fortress of fake paperwork. But you forgot one fundamental rule of financial crime, Cassandra. Money always leaves a fingerprint." I took a slow step toward her, the heels of my shoes clicking against the stone patio like the ticking of a clock running out of time. "I am an anti-money laundering specialist," I reminded her. "I build the exact algorithms the federal government uses to hunt down international cartels and corporate embezzlers. You thought you could hide domestic real estate fraud from me. I spent 3 years running your entire life through my forensic software. I mapped every single wire transfer. I tracked every inflated invoice coming out of Marcus and his failing construction company. I followed the digital blood spatter of my mother's stolen legacy across 3 different states." Cassandra swallowed hard, pressing her back against the heavy wooden dining chair, as if she could merge into the fabric and disappear completely. "But digital trails only tell half the story." I continued, maintaining a relentless, steady rhythm. "They show the theft, but they do not capture the malice. For that, I needed to find the physical anchor. And you made one fatal, arrogant mistake. You missed a recurring automated payment of $75 a month, buried deep within a forgotten subsidiary account my mother managed before she got sick." I paused, letting the specific dollar amount hang in the heavy afternoon air. I watched Cassandra's eyes dart back and forth as she desperately tried to calculate what that minor fee could possibly represent in her web of million-dollar crimes. "It was a maintenance fee," I clarified, my voice slicing right through her rising panic, "for a private, high-security safe deposit box at a boutique wealth management bank in Midtown Atlanta. A box registered solely under my mother's maiden name. A box you never knew existed because my mother opened it 2 weeks after you were hired to be her hospice nurse." Marcus suddenly stepped forward, his face draining of all color. "A safe deposit box? What are you talking about, Nia?" I kept my eyes pinned entirely on Cassandra, refusing to acknowledge him. My mother was dying, but she was not stupid. And she certainly was not naive. She built a commercial empire in a city that constantly told Black women to settle for less. She knew exactly what kind of scavenger had crawled into her home. I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket and withdrew a small, heavy brass key. I held it up between my thumb and forefinger, letting the bright Georgia sunlight catch the intricate grooves of the cold metal. I walked into that midtown bank last month, I said, recounting the moment with razor-sharp clarity. I presented my federal credentials and my mother's original death certificate. The bank manager escorted me into a private underground vault that smelled of polished mahogany and old money. When I slid this key into box number 412, I expected to find offshore account numbers or hidden stock certificates. But my mother left me something infinitely more valuable than money. I slipped the key back into my pocket and pulled out a small, worn, leather-bound journal. The edges of the pages were frayed. The leather was cracked and aged. It was undeniably, unmistakably, my mother's handwriting stamped onto the cover. Marcus let out a sharp gasp, recognizing the book instantly. Cassandra stared at the leather journal as if I had just pulled a live grenade out of my jacket. She left me her final testimony, I declared. I opened the journal, the crisp sound of the aged paper echoing in the dead silence of the patio. Would you like to hear what she wrote during her final weeks on this earth? Cassandra, I asked, my tone dripping with absolute venom. Because it reads exactly like a psychological thriller. Let me quote her directly. October 2nd. The pain medication Cassandra administers makes the room spin. I notice the dosages are higher than what Dr. Evans prescribed. When I ask her about it, she simply smiles and pours more into my IV line. I am losing time. Entire days vanish. I took a step closer, my eyes burning into her terrified, trembling face. October 5th. I continued reading, my voice rising in power and authority. Marcus brought legal documents into my bedroom today. He would not look me in the eye. He smelled like cheap whiskey and desperation. Cassandra stood over my bed, holding my hand so tightly it bruised, guiding my fingers to sign papers I could not read. I know they are stealing everything. I am too weak to fight them physically, but I will not let them win. Cassandra let out a choked, desperate sob. She raised her hands to cover her ears, shaking her head violently. Stop it. Stop reading that. It is fake. You wrote that yourself. I have had a forensic handwriting analyst verify every single stroke of ink on these pages. I shot back, snapping the journal shut with a loud crack. It is fully admissible in federal court. My mother knew exactly what you were doing to her. She knew you were poisoning her with unauthorized doses of fentanyl to keep her incapacitated. She knew you and Marcus were liquidating the commercial properties to save his failing business. She knew you were a vulture waiting for her heart to stop beating so you could steal her crown. I stepped right up to Cassandra, invading her space, forcing her to look at the daughter of the woman she had tormented and drugged. She spent her final moments of lucidity securing this journal and the original untampered deeds to her properties. I said, my voice a deadly quiet force. She hired a private courier to move them to that safe deposit box while you and Marcus were out shopping for her casket. She knew she was going to die. But she also knew that she had raised a daughter who would never let you get away with it. The entire garden was completely motionless. The wealthy guests, the politicians, the developers, they were all staring at Cassandra with absolute revulsion. The elegant hostess was completely gone. In her place was a woman who had orchestrated the slow, calculated demise of a helpless patient just to fund her own rampant greed. You thought you won, I told her, my eyes locked onto hers with unrelenting intensity. You threw me out of this house 5 years ago because you thought I was a broken, useless college dropout. You told me I was a disappointment. But all you did was give me the exact motivation I needed to become your absolute worst nightmare. I did not just survive your cruelty, Cassandra. I weaponized it. I turned away from her trembling figure and took a slow step back toward the center of the patio. By doing so, I forced every single person in that garden to look at the entire picture. The wealthy politicians, the prominent developers, and the high society influencers were all frozen in place. They looked like statues scattered across a crime scene. Nobody was drinking their champagne. Nobody was whispering anymore. They were simply staring in absolute horror at the crumbling foundation of my father's fake empire. To the distinguished guests standing on this patio today, I announced, projecting my voice so that it carried all the way to the iron gates of the estate. You all came here to celebrate wealth and success. You admire people who know how to build capital. So let us take a masterclass in exactly how Cassandra and Chloe built theirs. Because stealing a commercial deed from a dying woman is only step one. The real challenge, the part that actually requires a brain, is making that stolen money look completely clean to the United States federal government. I looked at Chloe, who was still slumped in her chair, her face buried in her hands. Then I looked at Marcus, who was staring at me with a sickening realization dawning in his eyes. Money laundering is a very specific science. I continued pacing methodically in front of the grand outdoor dining table. It requires placement layering and integration. It requires moving dirty cash through enough legitimate-looking channels that the authorities lose the scent. Chloe, with her real estate license and her profound arrogance, thought she knew exactly how to beat the system. She set up 7 different limited liability companies. She used anonymous registered agents in Delaware and Wyoming states, known for protecting corporate privacy. She thought hiding behind a registered agent would make her invisible. I paused, letting the sheer weight of their federal crimes settle over the garden. My mother's commercial properties generate hundreds of thousands of dollars in legitimate rental every single month, I said. The Midtown retail complex houses national corporate tenants. The Southside warehouses lease space to major logistics firms. When Cassandra forged my mother's signature to transfer those deeds into Chloe's shell companies, they did not just steal the brick-and-mortar buildings. They hijacked the entire cash flow. Suddenly, those massive corporate rent checks were no longer going into my mother's highly regulated trust account. I pointed directly at Chloe, whose shoulders shook with violent sobs. They were being diverted directly into the bank accounts of those anonymous Delaware LLCs, I declared. But Chloe and Cassandra had a massive problem. You cannot just walk into a bank and withdraw $100,000 in cash every month without triggering a suspicious activity report with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. The bank would flag it immediately. So they had to create a reason for that money to move. They had to layer it. I walked over to the buffet table and picked up a crystal water glass, admiring the expensive craftsmanship before setting it back down with a sharp clink. This is where you all got incredibly greedy and incredibly stupid. I told them, my eyes sweeping over the 4 guilty faces of my so-called family. You started drafting fake vendor invoices. You build your own shell companies for phantom property management services. You created fake landscaping contracts, fake maintenance repairs, and fake consulting fees. You funneled the stolen rent money through 3 different corporate bank accounts to wash the dirt off it. And then finally, you integrated that money right back into your own pockets. I looked directly at my father. That is how you bailed out your failing construction firm, Marcus, I said, stripping away the last remaining shred of his pride. You co-mingled clean construction revenue with the dirty laundered rent money Cassandra funneled to you. You used my mother's stolen legacy to pay off your creditors and keep your business afloat. And you, Cassandra, used your cut of the washed money to buy this ridiculous mansion, to fill your closets with designer clothes, and to throw lavish parties like this one to convince everyone in Atlanta that you were old money royalty. Cassandra shook her head weakly, her voice completely hoarse. We paid the mortgages. We kept the properties running. We did not steal the rent, we just managed it. You committed textbook tax evasion. I fired back instantly, crushing her pathetic defense before anyone could even process it. When you diverted that commercial rental income into your shell companies, you deliberately bypassed the Internal Revenue Service. You claimed those fake property management invoices as deductible business expenses. You failed to issue standard tax forms to your phantom vendors. You generated millions of dollars in capital gains and rental revenue, and you intentionally hid every single dime of it from the federal government to avoid paying taxes. The word taxes hit the garden like a bomb. The wealthy developers and business owners standing around the patio physically recoiled. In the United States, you can manipulate a lot of things, but you do not ever mess with the IRS. You pierced your own corporate veil, I explained, my tone clinical and relentless. You used those Delaware LLCs as your personal piggy banks. You bought Jamal's sports car directly from a corporate operating account. You paid for Chloe's luxury vacations using commercial property maintenance funds. The moment you mixed personal expenses with corporate revenue, you destroyed any legal protection those shell companies offered you. You handed the federal prosecutors a perfectly wrapped gift. I watched my father stagger slightly, putting a hand on the back of a chair to steady himself. He understood business law. He knew exactly what piercing the corporate veil meant. He knew that the personal assets they thought they had secured were now entirely exposed to federal seizure. I spent the last 18 months compiling a 500-page forensic audit of your entire money laundering network, I announced, ensuring my voice reached every corner of the property. I tracked every fake invoice. I matched the IP addresses used to authorize the wire transfers directly to the router inside this very house. I have the digital signature stamps, the bank routing numbers, and the corresponding tax fraud files neatly organized and cross-referenced. The guests were completely mesmerized by the absolute destruction unfolding in front of them. The sheer scale of the financial crimes was staggering. They had come to celebrate Mother's Day, but instead they were witnessing the real-time dismantling of a criminal syndicate operating out of a Buckhead mansion. "You called me an ugly college dropout," I said, looking right into Cassandra's terrified eyes. "You told me I was a failure because I did not fit into your shallow, materialistic world. You thought my silence over the past 5 years meant I was defeated. But my silence was just the time it took to build an airtight, federally compliant case against every single one of you. I did not drop out of life. I acquired the exact professional credentials required to lock you in a federal penitentiary for the rest of your natural life." Cassandra sank to her knees right there on the imported stone patio. Her emerald green gown pooled around her as she collapsed under the crushing weight of her inescapable reality. She was not just losing her wealth. She was losing her freedom, her status, and her entire identity. I stood tall in the center of the patio, surrounded by the wreckage of their arrogance. The wide view of the garden captured the perfect poetic justice of the moment. The elite guests standing in stunned silence. Chloe sobbing uncontrollably in her chair. Jamal paralyzed by his own cowardice. Marcus gripping a chair to keep from collapsing, and Cassandra kneeling on the ground in total defeat. They had spent decades building a fortress of lies, and I had just torn it down to the studs without breaking a single sweat. I let my gaze sweep slowly across the patio, watching the ripple effect of my words wash over the crowd. The absolute silence that had gripped the garden finally broke, replaced by a low, frantic hum that sounded like a disturbed hornet's nest. The camera of my attention panned seamlessly from face to face, capturing the real-time destruction of the flawless social image my family had spent 5 years and millions of stolen dollars trying to cultivate. To my left, the prominent city judge who had been cheerfully toasting Cassandra just 20 minutes ago was now speed-walking toward the side gate. He did not even bother to say goodbye. He simply handed his half-full champagne flute to a bewildered waiter, tapped his security detail on the shoulder, and marched off the property as if the grass itself were contagious. A man in his position could not afford to be photographed within 100 yards of a confessed federal money laundering operation, let alone one involving elder abuse. To my right, the group of wealthy commercial developers who had been laughing at my father's jokes were rapidly backing away. They were practically tripping over each other to put physical distance between themselves and Marcus. One of them, a man who had recently partnered with my father's construction firm on a massive downtown high-rise, already had his phone pressed tightly to his ear. I could hear his panicked, hushed voice demanding that his corporate legal team freeze all joint escrow accounts immediately. Loyalty in this tier of Atlanta high society extended exactly as far as the profit margins. The moment federal indictments were mentioned, Marcus went from being a respected mogul to an absolute pariah. But it was the socialites, Cassandra's so-called inner circle, who delivered the most brutal judgment of all. I watched the panning scene unfold among the women in their custom silk dresses and wide-brimmed hats. These were the exact same women who had giggled behind their manicured hands when Cassandra mocked me for bringing cheap wine. Now those manicured hands were flying across their smartphone screens. The tapping of acrylic nails against glass displays sounded like rain hitting a tin roof. They were texting furiously. The Buckhead Gossip Network had been fully activated, and the true story of Cassandra's wealth was being broadcasted to every country club, beauty salon, and charity board in the state of Georgia. I saw one woman, Someone Cassandra frequently hosted for private tennis matches, lean into her husband's shoulder and whisper entirely too loud. I knew they could not afford this property. A hospice nurse. How utterly repulsive. The whispered judgments cut through the warm air, sharp and unforgiving. The beautiful floral centerpieces and the towering ice sculptures suddenly looked incredibly cheap, like props on a fraudulent movie set. The luxurious facade had been violently ripped away, exposing the rot underneath. Cassandra looked up from her position on her knees. Her emerald green gown was stained with spilled water from the patio stones, and her expensive mascara ran in dark, jagged lines down her face. She reached a trembling hand out toward the women she considered her closest friends, her eyes silently begging for a shred of sympathy, for someone to step forward and tell her it would be all right. Instead, the women physically recoiled. One of them literally pulled her designer handbag closer to her chest as if she thought Cassandra might try to steal it right there in the garden. Another turned her back entirely, refusing to even make eye contact. The social execution was absolute. In their world, going bankrupt was an unfortunate tragedy, but getting caught stealing a dying black female entrepreneur's legacy to fund a fake lifestyle was an unforgivable, sickening sin. The public humiliation had completely reversed its trajectory. Cassandra had brought me here to serve as the sacrificial lamb for her Mother's Day performance. She had wanted to elevate her own status by standing on my neck. Now the heavy heel of high society was stepping directly onto hers. I watched Marcus absorb the sheer magnitude of his social death. His broad shoulders caved inward, the arrogant posture he had maintained for decades dissolved into nothing. For a man like my father, reputation was his actual lifeblood. It was oxygen. He could survive losing money, but he could not survive losing the respect of his peers. He looked at the men he golfed with, the men he drank scotch with, and he saw nothing but disgust reflected back at him. They were looking at a coward who had sold out his own blood for a financial bailout. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some kind of defense, but his voice completely failed him. There was absolutely nothing he could say that would clean the dirt off his name. Chloe was still weeping uncontrollably in her chair, but even her tears garnered zero sympathy from the crowd. A prominent real estate broker standing near the bar looked at her with pure professional disdain, already shaking his head at the radioactive fallout her crimes would bring to their industry. Jamal stood frozen next to her, completely ignored by everyone. He was not even worth their scorn. He was just the pathetic collateral damage of a much larger conspiracy. I stood perfectly still, letting the chaotic symphony of their destruction wash over me. I did not need to raise my voice again. I did not need to hurl any more insults. The elite society they had worshipped and catered to was doing all the punishing for me. The whispers, the averted gazes, the frantic phone calls to attorneys, it was a flawless, merciless judgment. Every single lie they had ever told, to inflate their status, was now acting as an anchor, dragging them straight to the bottom of the ocean. They had built a beautiful, shining glass house on a foundation of stolen money and deceit. I had simply provided the single stone needed to shatter it into a million irreparable pieces. As the last few guests hurried toward the valet station, abandoning their half-eaten gourmet meals and their crystal champagne flutes, the patio grew incredibly sparse. The grand Mother's Day brunch had turned into a ghost town of abandoned luxury. The only people left were the caterers, who were quietly and efficiently packing up their equipment, and the five of us trapped in the center of the wreckage. The silence that settled over the remaining group was heavier than before. It was the silence of absolute, inescapable ruin. There was no more audience to perform for. There were no more rich friends to hide behind. The stage had been cleared, the lights had been cut, and they were finally forced to look directly at the reality of what they had done. I adjusted the strap of my designer handbag on my shoulder, my posture radiating the calm, unwavering authority of a woman who had just won a 5-year war. I looked down at Cassandra, who was still kneeling on the cold stone, weeping into her hands. I looked at Marcus, who was staring blankly at the empty driveway where his friends had just fled. They had absolutely nothing left to hide behind. The social armor was gone, and now, stripped of their wealthy defenders and their fake prestige, they were going to have to face the legal and financial nightmare that was waiting for them just beyond the iron gates of their stolen mansion. The heavy silence of the abandoned patio was suddenly shattered by a sharp theatrical wail. Cassandra, still kneeling on the cold stone, shifted her tactic with the speed of a cornered rattlesnake. The sheer paralyzing terror that had gripped her just moments ago melted away, instantly replaced by a flawless, desperate performance of absolute victimhood. She knew the federal evidence I brought was insurmountable. She knew the guests were gone. But she also knew she had one single, fragile lifeline left standing right next to her. She lunged forward, her hands grasping desperately at Marcus' tailored suit pants. She buried her face against his leg, her shoulders heaving with violent manufactured sobs. "Marcus, please," Cassandra cried out, her voice cracking with the perfect amount of heartbreak. "You have to stop her. You have to make her stop doing this to us." I looked down at her from my position in the center of the patio. The physical disparity between us was striking. I stood perfectly upright, an immovable force of truth, while she groveled in the spilled water and ruined luxury of her own making. The view from up here was incredibly revealing. I could see the exact moment her tears shifted from genuine fear of federal prison to weaponized manipulation. Marcus looked down at his wife, his broad chest rising and falling heavily. He was completely shattered by the social execution he had just endured, his mind desperately searching for any possible exit hatch. Cassandra sensed that vulnerability and immediately dug her claws into it. She fabricated all of this. Cassandra wept, lifting her tear-streaked face to look at my father. Her makeup was ruined, her eyes wide and pleading. "Marcus, look at me. It is me, your wife. The woman who stood by you when this ungrateful girl ran away and abandoned us. You know how much I sacrificed for this family. You know I dedicated my entire life to taking care of your first wife when she was dying. I held her hand. I bathed her. I loved her. I did not interrupt. I simply crossed my arms and watched the masterclass in psychological manipulation unfold. It was textbook gaslighting, a strategy she had perfected over 20 years. Nia has hated me since the day I stepped foot in this house." Cassandra continued, her voice rising in a frantic, desperate pitch. "She resented me for trying to be a mother to her. She resented you for finding happiness again. She is a deeply disturbed, bitter woman, Marcus. She spent the last 5 years nursing this psychotic obsession with me, and now she has hired people to forge these ridiculous bank statements and fake journals just to destroy our marriage. She has always been mentally unstable. You remember how she used to act. She needs psychiatric help, not a captive audience." She clung tighter to his arm, pulling herself up slightly so she could press her face against his chest. It was a pathetic, sickening display of calculated frailty. She was twisting the narrative, taking the very real grief and isolation I had suffered as a teenager and weaponizing it to paint me as a delusional stalker. "Think about it, Marcus," she sobbed, her fingers digging into his expensive linen jacket. "How could a college dropout possibly access federal banking records? How could she bypass international shell companies? It is impossible. She is lying to you. She paid someone to print out those fake audit reports just to humiliate us in front of your friends. She wants to tear this family apart because she is utterly miserable and cannot stand to see us thriving." I let out a slow, steady breath. The audacity was almost impressive. Even with the physical evidence scattered across the patio, even with a verified forensic journal written in my mother's own hand, Cassandra was still trying to convince my father that the sky was green and the grass was blue. She was preying directly on his massive, fragile ego. She knew Marcus could not stomach the reality that he had been played by a hospice nurse. He needed an alternate reality where he was still the smart, capable patriarch who was simply being victimized by a vindictive, unstable daughter. "I gave up everything for you," Cassandra wailed, playing her final desperate chord. "I dealt with Nia's tantrums. I dealt with her disrespect. I kept this house running and supported your business when it was failing. And this is how she repays me. By trying to frame me for crimes I did not commit. You have to defend your wife, Marcus. You have to protect me from her." Chloe, who had been sitting in paralyzed silence, suddenly saw an opportunity to save herself. She wiped her nose and quickly nodded her head. "She is right, Marcus," Chloe chimed in, her voice trembling but eager to join the delusion. "Nia has been obsessed with taking us down. Those notary stamps she showed you, they could easily be photoshopped. Anyone can buy a fake stamp online. She is just trying to scare us, so we will hand over control of the company. It is an extortion attempt. I did not even look at Chloe. I kept my eyes locked onto my father. I watched the gears turning in his head. I watched him weigh the insurmountable concrete evidence of massive financial fraud against the comfortable, convenient lie Cassandra was desperately feeding him. A fake journal, I finally said, my voice cutting through Cassandra's loud, theatrical sobs. I did not yell. I spoke with the calm, measured cadence of a professional explaining a simple concept to a very slow child. You are currently kneeling on a patio paid for by a Delaware shell company that I have already seized, and your best defense is that I went to an arts and crafts store and forged an entire diary just because I was feeling a little petty. You are a liar! Cassandra shrieked, turning her head to glare at me while keeping her arms firmly wrapped around my father. You have always been a liar. You were a horrible daughter, and you are a horrible person. Marcus, tell her to leave. Tell her to get off our property right now before I call the police myself. She is trespassing. She was banking on the fact that if she cried loud enough, played the victim hard enough, and stroked my father's ego just right, he would pull up the drawbridge and lock me out. She was using the exact same emotional manipulation she had used to convince him to marry her 3 months after my mother died, wrapping her venom in a cloak of devotion. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the woman who had stolen my mother's crown. The high angle of my perspective made her look incredibly small, incredibly weak, and entirely transparent. I did not need to argue with her. I did not need to defend my sanity or my credentials. The truth did not require my defense. I simply waited for Marcus to make his choice, knowing that whatever he decided next would seal his ultimate fate. The camera of my attention locked onto my father's face, zooming in tight on the rigid lines of his jaw and the frantic darting movements of his eyes. I watched the brutal internal war waging behind his stare. For a few agonizing seconds, the truth actually pierced through his thick skull. He looked at the forensic audit sitting on the table. He looked at the medical charts. He knew I was right. The math was flawless, and Marcus, for all his moral bankruptcy, was a man who understood ledgers. I knew exactly how much money his construction firm had been losing before my mother died, and he knew exactly how miraculously his debts had disappeared the moment Cassandra took over the accounts. He realized in that fleeting moment of clarity that he had been played for an absolute fool. He had been manipulated, managed, and bought by a hospice nurse who saw him as nothing more than a convenient, gullible signature. But then I watched the camera angle of his psyche violently shift. The sheer crushing weight of that realization collided directly with his massive, fragile masculine pride. Marcus was a man who had built his entire identity on projecting strength, control, and wealth. He was the patriarch, the big boss on the construction site, the man who sat at the head of the table at the country club. Admitting that I was right meant admitting that he was weak. It meant standing in front of the remaining catering staff, his terrified son, and his weeping wife, and confessing that he had been a blind, pathetic pawn in a criminal conspiracy against his own dying wife. It meant accepting that his entire current lifestyle was a fraudulent illusion. His ego simply could not process that level of humiliation. So his brain did what cowards always do when faced with undeniable accountability. It snapped violently in the opposite direction. The vulnerability on his face vanished, instantly replaced by a mask of explosive defensive fury. The veins in his thick neck bulged against the crisp white collar of his custom linen shirt. His hands curled into tight fists. He was not going to surrender to the truth. He was going to forcefully protect the beautiful, comfortable lie he had been living for the past 5 years, even if it meant destroying his own daughter to do it. "Get up," Cassandra, Marcus commanded, his voice rumbling with that deep, aggressive baritone he used to terrorize his subcontractors. He reached down, grabbing her by the arm and hauling her roughly to her feet. He pulled her against his side, shielding her with his body, officially drawing the battle lines in the stone of the patio. He turned his furious, bloodshot eyes on me. "You have completely lost your mind, Nia," he boomed, stepping forward to try and tower over me. "You march onto my property on Mother's Day, a day meant for family and celebration, and you throw this unhinged, psychotic tantrum just because you could not handle the fact that we moved on without you." I kept my chin raised, letting his hot, desperate anger wash right over me. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I just watched a weak man dig his own grave. "You are an ungrateful, bitter child!" Marcus shouted, his voice echoing loudly against the walls of the stolen mansion. "After everything I did for you, after I put a roof over your head and food on your table, you abandoned this family. You packed your bags 5 years ago and turned your back on your own flesh and blood because you were too arrogant to respect my authority. And now you come crawling back here with a briefcase full of fake documents and wild conspiracy theories, trying to tear down the woman who actually stayed and held this family together." He pointed a thick, accusatory finger right at my face. "Cassandra has been 10 times the woman and 10 times the mother to you that you ever deserved," he spat, wrapping his arm tighter around Cassandra's shaking shoulders. "She saved my business. She manages these properties with grace and intelligence. She is the reason this family is respected in Atlanta. You are nothing but a jealous, miserable failure who wants to drag everyone else down into the gutter with you because you cannot stand to see us happy." Cassandra leaned into his chest, letting out a soft, dramatic whimper of gratitude, fully leaning into her role as the rescued maiden. Chloe and Jamal, seeing their patriarch finally take a stand, seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. If Marcus was denying the evidence, then they could all keep pretending the nightmare was not real. They were all collectively agreeing to live in the delusion. "I look at you right now, and I do not even recognize you." Marcus continued, his tone dripping with manufactured disappointment. "You are not my daughter. My daughter would never disrespect my wife this way. My daughter would never try to frame her own family for crimes just to get her hands on money she never worked for. You have let your greed and your jealousy completely rot your brain." He took a deep breath, puffing his chest out, trying to reclaim the ultimate authority of the property. "I am not going to look at your fake papers, Nia. I am not going to listen to another word of this extortion attempt. This is my house. This is my property. I built this life, and I will not let a deranged, estranged child walk in here and disrespect my wife." He raised his arm and pointed firmly toward the sprawling iron gates at the end of the driveway. "You are done here," Marcus decreed, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "Pack up your little briefcase and get off my property. I am officially cutting you off. You get nothing from me. You get nothing from this estate. You are entirely dead to this family. If I ever see your face anywhere near my wife, my son, or my home again, I will not just call the police. I will have my lawyers bury you so deep in defamation lawsuits you will never work in this city again. Now get out." He stood tall, his jaw set fully, believing he had just won the war. He believed he had reasserted his dominance, protected his stolen kingdom, and successfully banished the threat. He thought his booming voice and his harsh words had put me back in my place, reducing me to the powerless, grieving girl he had discarded 5 years ago. I let his words hang in the air. I let the absolute silence settle over the patio once more. I looked at the smug, relieved expression returning to Cassandra's face. I looked at Jamal and Chloe, who were visibly relaxing their shoulders. And then I looked right back into my father's arrogant, foolish eyes. I did not cry. I did not yell back. I simply let a cold, genuine smile spread across my face. The camera of my attention shifted, positioning itself squarely behind Marcus. From over his broad, tense shoulder, the view framed me standing entirely alone in the center of the sprawling stone patio. He was a massive, looming figure dominating the foreground. His fists clenched rigidly at his sides, his chest heaving with the exertion of his own manufactured outrage. But despite his physical size, despite the towering brick mansion rising up behind him and the stolen wealth he was desperately trying to use as a shield, I was the one who controlled the frame. I stood there perfectly upright in my navy power suit, a solitary pillar of absolute truth, surrounded by a kingdom of lies. And I was smiling. It was not a smile of amusement. It was the terrifying, hollow smile of a woman who had just watched the last remaining thread of her childhood snap and realized she did not feel the urge to catch it. Marcus saw that smile, and it infuriated him even more. He expected tears. He expected me to break down, to plead for his affection, to revert to the devastated young girl he had thrown out onto the street 5 years ago. My total lack of surrender pushed him right over the edge. Wipe that smirk off your face, Marcus snarled. His voice vibrated with a vicious, absolute finality. He took another step forward, filling the space between us with pure hostility. You think this is a game. You think you can stand there and judge me. I built a life that people respect. This house, this property, the money in our accounts, it belongs to me and Cassandra. We are the masters of this estate. We earned every single thing we have, and I will be damned if I let an ungrateful, spiteful brat try to take it away from us just because she failed at her own life. He pointed toward the heavy iron gates at the end of the long, manicured driveway. Get out right now, he commanded, his words cracking like a whip across the silent garden. I mean it, Nia. I want you off my property this second. You are no daughter of mine. You are a disease to this family. Take your fake documents, take your pathetic jealousy, and get out of my sight. And do not ever show your face here again. If you ever try to contact me or Cassandra or your brother, I will personally ensure you are locked away for harassment. You are dead to us. The words hung in the air, sharp and absolute. You are dead to us. Behind my cold, unyielding expression, a profound, agonizing fracture occurred. No amount of professional success, no amount of forensic auditing, and no amount of emotional preparation can fully shield a daughter from the devastating impact of her own father actively choosing a criminal over her. Deep down beneath the armor of the relentless investigator, I had become a tiny fractured piece of my soul, had still harbored a microscopic shred of hope. A foolish, childish hope that when faced with the undeniable black and white evidence of Cassandra's monstrous crimes against my dying mother, my father would finally wake up. I had hoped that the truth would snap him out of his delusion. I had hoped that for once in his life he would choose me. He would choose my mother's memory. He would choose what was right. But looking at him now, seeing the vicious protective way he shielded the woman who had literally drugged his first wife and robbed his daughter blind, that final foolish hope completely disintegrated. It turned to ash and blew away in the warm Atlanta breeze. Marcus was not a victim of manipulation. He was a willing, eager participant in his own corruption. He loved the illusion of wealth far more than he had ever loved me, and he loved his fragile pride infinitely more than he respected the truth. The pain of that ultimate rejection was blinding, a sharp physical ache in the center of my chest. But I did not let a single ounce of that agony reach my eyes. I swallowed the grief, burying it deep beneath layers of impenetrable professional resolve. The time for mourning the father I never really had was over. Now there was only the audit. There was only the execution of justice. My smile did not falter. In fact, it grew slightly wider, settling into a look of pure, detached, chilling acceptance. I understand perfectly, Marcus, I said. My voice was eerily calm, contrasting violently with his booming rage. It was smooth, leveled, and completely devoid of any familial warmth. You have made your choice incredibly clear. You are claiming absolute ownership of this life, this house, and this woman. You are officially staking your claim to everything standing on this property. That is right, Marcus barked, jutting his chin out, mistaking my calm acknowledgement for surrender. It is mine, all of it. I nodded slowly, maintaining that terrifying, unwavering eye contact. I want you to remember that you said that I told him, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. I want you to remember that when the dust settles, you stood on this patio, looked me dead in the eye, and claimed full responsibility for every single asset attached to your name. You just claimed ownership of the entire sinking ship. I took a very slow, deliberate breath, shifting my weight slightly as I prepared to close the casket on our relationship entirely. You are right about one thing, though. I continued, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal authority. I am not your daughter anymore. Your daughter died 5 years ago when you let that woman throw her out of her own home. The person standing in front of you right now is just a senior investigator who happens to know every single one of your financial secrets. You asked me to leave your property. You told me never to show my face here again. I accept your terms, Marcus. I accept your total and complete severance of our family tie. I watched him breathe heavily, his chest rising and falling as he glared at me. He truly believed he had won. He truly believed his loud voice and his patriarchal authority had successfully banished the threat from his kingdom. Cassandra peeked out from behind his broad back, a look of immense, venomous relief washing over her tear-stained face. Chloe and Jamal remained frozen by the outdoor dining table, silently celebrating the fact that the storm seemed to be passing. They all thought the confrontation was over. They thought I was going to pack up my briefcase, turn around, and walk down the long driveway in defeat, leaving them to sweep the forged documents and the money laundering accusations under their expensive imported rugs. They thought they had survived. I stood there for 3 more seconds, letting them marinate in their false sense of victory. I let them savor the illusion of safety. I let Marcus feel like the king of his $1 million castle. And then I slowly reached into the front pocket of my tailored navy blazer. My hand emerged holding my cell phone. The screen was completely dark, but my fingers wrapped tightly around its edges, holding the absolute destruction of their entire reality in the palm of my hand. I did not break eye contact with Marcus. I just kept smiling that cold, hollow smile as I raised the phone slightly, letting the sunlight catch the sleek glass surface. The execution was at hand, and I was about to show them exactly who owned the ground they were standing on. The perspective shifted, dropping low to the ground, angling upward to frame me against the vast, cloudless Atlanta sky. From this vantage point, the dynamic was undeniable. I was no longer the discarded daughter or the unwelcome guest. I was a towering, immovable force of absolute reckoning. The massive brick facade of the mansion behind me seemed to shrink in comparison to the sheer gravity of my presence. Marcus and Cassandra, huddled together in their ruined finery, looked small, fragile, and utterly powerless. I held my cell phone in my right hand. I did not cry. I did not show a single ounce of sorrow for the family tie that had just been permanently severed. My face was a mask of cold, calculated precision. I slowly raised the device, my thumb resting gently on the dark screen. The reaction was instantaneous. The patio was so quiet you could hear the distant rustle of the oak trees lining the property. But the silence was heavy, suffocating, and thick with terror. Every single person remaining in that garden held their breath. Marcus stiffened his chest, expanding as he braced himself. His eyes were glued to the device in my hand. Cassandra let out a sharp, ragged gasp, burying her face into his shoulder. Over by the dining table, Chloe covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with unadulterated panic. Jamal actually took a step backward, bumping into the stone railing as if trying to merge with the masonry. They all thought the exact same thing. They thought I was dialing 911. They thought I was calling the Fulton County Police to report the assault, the forged medical directives, and the massive financial fraud. They were already picturing the flashing red and blue lights pulling up their pristine driveway. They were imagining the humiliation of being escorted out of their own private gated community in handcuffs while their wealthy neighbors watched from their balconies. I did not press a single button. I did not dial a number. I simply let them marinate in the agonizing, excruciating torture of their own imaginations. I kept the phone poised in my hand and allowed the seconds to tick by. 1, 2, 3. I weaponized the silence. In my line of work, I learned very early on that guilty people cannot handle silence. Silence forces them to confront the reality of their crimes. It strips away their ability to argue, to gaslight, or to manipulate the narrative. When you give a guilty person absolute silence, their own mind will punish them far worse than any interrogation tactic ever could. "Are you calling the police?" Marcus demanded. His voice was loud, but the booming, intimidating resonance was completely gone. It was brittle. It cracked on the final syllable. He took a hesitant half-step forward, caught between the urge to snatch the phone from my hand and the paralyzing fear of committing assault in front of witnesses. "Do not do this, Nia. Think about the family. Think about the press." I did not answer him. I let my thumb hover over the screen, the bright backlight illuminating my face in the shadows of the patio awning. Cassandra could not take it anymore. The psychological pressure cracked her completely in half. She broke away from Marcus, throwing her hands out toward me in a desperate, pathetic gesture of surrender. "We will give the money back!" Cassandra shrieked, her voice echoing wildly across the empty garden. "We will pay you back every single dime. I swear to God, Nia, we can set up a trust. We can transfer the properties back into your name today. Just put the phone away. Please. You do not have to call the authorities. We can fix this quietly." Her confession hung in the air, a desperate, undeniable admission of guilt, blurted out in a moment of sheer panic. Marcus turned to her, his face twisting in horror, as he realized his wife had just verbally confessed to a federal crime, simply because I was holding a piece of glass and metal in my hand. "Shut up," Cassandra, Marcus hissed, grabbing her arm and pulling her back roughly. "Do not say another word." But the damage was done. The fortress had completely crumbled from the inside out. They were turning on each other, scrambling for survival, willing to trade their dignity and their stolen wealth just to avoid the flashing lights of a police cruiser. Chloe suddenly pushed past Jamal, stepping away from the dining table. Her mascara was completely ruined, smudged into dark hollows under her eyes. She held her hands up in a gesture of frantic surrender. "I will testify," Chloe blurted out, her voice pitching into a hysterical squeak. "Nia, listen to me. I will cooperate. I will tell the real estate commission everything they want to know. I will give them the original notary logs. Just please tell the police I was manipulated. Tell them Cassandra made me do it. I have my whole life ahead of me. I cannot go to prison for her." "You treacherous little snake!" Cassandra screamed, lunging toward her daughter-in-law. Marcus had to wrap both arms around her waist to hold her back, wrestling her away from Chloe, while Jamal stood frozen, completely paralyzed by the implosion of the two women who ran his life. I stood rooted to my spot, watching the absolute destruction of their loyalties. They were cannibalizing each other. The perfect, polished, wealthy Atlanta family was tearing itself to shreds, offering each other up as sacrificial lambs to save their own skin. This was the true face of their empire: cowardice, betrayal, and unmitigated greed. I slowly lowered the phone, holding it loosely at my side. The sudden movement caused everyone to freeze. They stopped shouting. They stopped struggling. They turned their terrified, tear-stained faces back to me, waiting for the final verdict. They waited for the sound of sirens in the distance. They waited for the inevitable arrival of law enforcement. "You all have a very fundamental misunderstanding of who I am," I said. My voice was a soft, icy whisper that carried effortlessly across the silent stone. "You look at me, and you still see the victim. You see the devastated girl you threw out onto the street 5 years ago. You think I came here today to seek validation, to throw a tantrum, and to dial 911 so that someone else could come and rescue me." I took a slow, measured step forward, closing the distance between us. "Calling the police is what victims do," I explained, looking directly into my father's wide, terrified eyes. "Calling the authorities is what you do when you need someone else to fight your battles. It is what you do when you want a detective to sort through the mess and a judge to hand down a sentence." I raised the phone again, but this time I turned the screen so they could all see it. There was no dial pad on the display. There was no active call to an emergency dispatcher. There was only a bright, crisp email confirmation showing a finalized corporate transaction. "I am not a victim, Marcus." I stated, the absolute certainty of my power rolling over them like a tidal wave. "And I do not need to call the police to take everything away from you. I already took it." I tapped the screen once, locking the device, and slipped it smoothly back into the pocket of my blazer. The psychological warfare was over. I had let them strip away their own dignity. I had let them confess their crimes, beg for mercy, and betray one another in the span of 3 minutes. They had completely disarmed themselves. Now it was time to deliver the final crushing blow. It was time to show them exactly why a forensic accountant with federal clearance was infinitely more dangerous than a squad car full of local police officers. I watched their eyes track the movement of the phone disappearing into my pocket. My lips curved upward into a slow, devastating smile. It was the smile of a predator that had already swallowed its prey whole, completely stripping them of any remaining delusion of control. "You see, Cassandra, laundering commercial rent money is a highly tedious process." I began, my voice gliding through the air with effortless authority. "It takes time to wash those funds through your little Delaware shell companies. But maintaining the illusion of Atlanta high society requires immediate, massive liquidity. The property taxes on a Buckhead mansion, the country club, dues, the imported champagne, the designer gowns you love to parade around in. The burn rate of your fake lifestyle was drastically outpacing the speed of your money laundering operation." I took a slow, calculated step toward her. She remained on her knees, looking up at me with wide, uncomprehending eyes. You got sloppy because you got desperate, I explained. You needed a massive injection of liquid cash to keep Marcus from noticing the deficit. You needed to keep up appearances. So you did what every foolish, desperate amateur does when they are running out of runway. You leveraged the very ground we are standing on. Marcus jerked his head toward his wife, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. What is she talking about, Cassandra? He demanded, his voice thick with renewed panic. I did not let her answer. I was not going to give her a single second to spin another lie. She took out a massive secondary mortgage on this estate. Marcus, I stated cleanly, dropping the financial guillotine right on his chest. 14 months ago, Cassandra secretly leveraged the entire equity of this property. She signed the paperwork using the exact same forged power of attorney she used to steal my mother's commercial buildings. She took out a loan for $4.5 million just to keep the lights on and the champagne flowing. Marcus staggered back as if he had been physically struck in the jaw. He looked at Cassandra, whose silence was a blaring, undeniable confession. You mortgaged the house, he whispered, the sheer horror of the betrayal fully setting in. You mortgaged my house behind my back. But that is not even the best part, I interjected, refusing to let them detour into a marital dispute. The problem with borrowing $4.5 million is that the bank actually expects you to make the monthly payments. And when the commercial real estate market dipped last quarter, your little shell companies stopped generating enough clean cash to cover the debt. You defaulted, Cassandra. You missed 3 consecutive payments. I watched the last drop of blood leave her face. She knew exactly what happened when you defaulted on a loan of that magnitude. In the banking world, we call that a non-performing loan. I continued, my tone shifting into the crisp, ruthless cadence of a corporate executive. It becomes a toxic asset. Banks absolutely despise toxic assets. They do not want to deal with the messy foreclosure process, especially on high-profile luxury real estate tied to complex corporate structures. So they do what they always do. They package that toxic debt and sell it off quietly for pennies on the dollar to private equity funds. I reached into my pocket and retrieved my phone again. I did not unlock it. I just tapped the dark screen against my palm in a rhythmic, taunting beat. What you failed to realize, Cassandra, is that I am not just a federal auditor. For the past 2 years, I have also served as the managing director of distressed assets for Vanguard Capital Partners, a highly aggressive, highly capitalized private equity firm located right here in Atlanta. The words hung in the air, heavy and fatal. Chloe gasped, finally understanding the catastrophic trap they had walked blindly into. Jamal simply stared at me, his mouth slightly open, incapable of processing the magnitude of the checkmate. When the bank packaged your defaulted mortgage, I was the one sitting on the receiving end of the portfolio, I told them, savoring every single syllable. I saw the address. I saw the LLCs. I recognized your forged signatures. And I did not report it to the bank. I did not raise a red flag. I simply sat in my corner office and authorized my fund to purchase your bad debt entirely in cash. I stopped walking and planted my feet firmly on the imported stone patio, locking my eyes onto Marcus and Cassandra simultaneously. I bought your mortgage. I declared, the absolute finality of my statement crushing any remaining hope they had. I bought the debt. I own the paper. I own every single brick, every piece of imported stone, every chandelier, and every blade of grass on this property. You told me to get off your property, Marcus, I said, throwing his earlier threat right back into his teeth with merciless precision. You puffed out your chest and told me this was your kingdom. You were wrong. You are currently standing on real estate that belongs entirely to my private equity firm. I am your sole creditor, and you are massively, irreparably in default. I watched them mentally scramble, desperately searching for a loophole, a legal technicality, anything that could save them from the financial slaughterhouse I had just dragged them into. But there was no escape. I had built a cage out of their own greed, locked the door, and swallowed the key. I had not needed to call the police to strip them of their power. I had simply used the brutal, unforgiving machinery of the American financial system to completely annihilate them. The perspective began to widen, pulling back slowly to capture the sheer magnitude of the devastation. I stood perfectly still in the center of the patio, an immovable pillar of absolute authority. The physical distance between me and the people who had tormented me felt like a massive, unbridgeable chasm. Around me, the fraudulent empire was actively burning to the ground. Marcus, Cassandra, Jamal, and Chloe looked like scattered debris caught in the blast radius of a detonation they never saw coming. The contrast was absolute. I was radiating crisp professional power, while the family that had tried to destroy me was completely collapsing into the stone floor. In the state of Georgia, non-judicial foreclosure is a remarkably efficient process, I said, ensuring my voice remained smooth and perfectly modulated. You do not need a lengthy court battle when the loan agreements are breached this severely. All the bank had to do was publish the notice of default in the county legal organ for 4 consecutive weeks. 4 weeks, Cassandra. A full month of public notices printed right alongside the grocery store coupons and the local obituaries. I watched her eyes widen in pure, unadulterated horror. She had been completely oblivious to the legal machinery grinding her life into dust. "You never read them, did you?" I asked, stepping slightly to the left to command the entire visual field. "You were too busy booking caterers for this brunch, scheduling fittings for your designer gowns, and buying matching tennis outfits at the country club to notice that the legal clock on your fake reality was ticking down to zero. You ignored the certified letters. You ignored the warnings from the bank because you thought your social status somehow made you immune to the law." Marcus choked out a breath, his voice a raspy, desperate shadow of its former booming volume. "We have rights. There is a redemption period. We can restructure the debt. We can declare Chapter 11 bankruptcy and halt the seizure right now. I know how the system works." "You could have halted it," I corrected him cheerfully, shaking my head with feigned sympathy. "If you had actually been the one holding the deed. But you were not paying attention to the mailbox, Marcus. You let your wife manage the mail just like you let her manage your dying wife's medication." The final notice of foreclosure was delivered via certified mail 30 days ago. The auction occurred last Tuesday morning on the front steps of the Fulton County Courthouse. Vanguard Capital Partners was the highest and only bidder. The transaction cleared. The deed was officially recorded, stamped, and legally transferred. I took a slow, deep breath, tasting the absolute, undisputed victory in the warm afternoon air. I locked my eyes onto my father. His broad chest was heaving, his face slick with a cold, terrified sweat. The alpha male patriarch was completely gone, replaced by a broken, aging contractor who suddenly realized he had absolutely nothing to his name. "You looked me in the eye 20 minutes ago and told me to get off your property," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal timbre that left absolutely no room for negotiation. "You puffed out your chest, pointed at those iron gates, and told me to pack up my briefcase, walk out of your life, and never show my face here again. You told me I was dead to you." I took one final dominant step forward, forcing him to physically shrink back against the heavy outdoor dining table. "You are wrong, Marcus," I stated, delivering the final fatal blow with absolute precision. "This is not your house. This is not your property. You are currently trespassing on a seized corporate asset. You are the ones who need to pack your bags. You are the ones who need to walk down that driveway. You need to get off my property." The words struck him with the force of a physical execution. The absolute reality of his situation finally crushed the last remaining pillar of his ego. He had no house. He had no business. He had no legacy. The mansion he had used to intimidate me, the physical proof of his superiority and wealth, belonged entirely to the daughter he had discarded like trash. Cassandra let out a raw, guttural scream. It was not a calculated performance anymore. It was the horrific, agonizing sound of a woman realizing she was going to be sleeping on the street. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees, the expensive fabric of her emerald gown tearing against the rough stone patio. She reached out, trying to grab the hem of my tailored trousers, her face contorted in sheer naked terror. "Nia, please," Cassandra begged, her voice scraping violently against her throat. "I have nowhere to go. We have no money left. The accounts are completely frozen. You cannot just throw us out into the street. We are your family. Please have some mercy. Do not do this to us." I looked down at her grasping hands and took a smooth, deliberate step back, refusing to let her touch me. "Mercy," I repeated, tasting the bitter irony of the word. "Did you show my mother mercy when you increased her fentanyl dosage so you could forge her signature on those commercial deeds?" Did you show me mercy when you packed my belongings into trash bags and threw me out of my own childhood home because I was an inconvenient reminder of the woman you replaced? I shifted my gaze to Chloe and Jamal. They were clinging to each other near the ice sculpture, completely paralyzed by the fallout. They had just realized that their luxury cars, their designer clothes, and their entire identity were tied to the equity of this house. The foreclosure meant their credit lines would be instantly severed. They were going to wake up tomorrow morning with absolutely nothing, stripped of the fake mogul personas they had paraded around Atlanta. Yao built a fantasy world using stolen bricks. I told the four of them, my voice echoing across the empty, devastated garden. And now the landlord is here to collect the rent. Your lease is officially terminated. You have exactly 1 hour to gather whatever personal items you can carry in your hands. After that, the locks are being changed and anyone left inside will be arrested for criminal trespassing. Before Marcus could even process the reality of that 1 hour ultimatum, a new sound sliced through the heavy atmosphere of the patio. It started as a faint, high-pitched wail echoing over the tops of the massive oak trees lining the wealthy Buckhead neighborhood. Within seconds, the sound multiplied. It was not a single siren. It was a coordinated, shrieking chorus of emergency vehicles moving rapidly down the main avenue, completely shattering the quiet Sunday afternoon. Marcus jerked his head toward the front of the estate. The color that had completely drained from his face suddenly rushed back in a flush of desperate, delusional hope. He actually thought he was being rescued. He thought one of his wealthy friends who had fled the party had called the local Fulton County Police to report a disturbance. He puffed out his chest, attempting to pull the tattered shreds of his patriarchal authority back together. "You hear that?" Marcus demanded, pointing a thick, trembling finger toward the iron gates. "Your little extortion scheme is over. The authorities are here. You are going to leave this property in handcuffs." Cassandra stopped sobbing for a fraction of a second, wiping her ruined mascara as she looked desperately toward the driveway. Chloe and Jamal took a hesitant step forward, clinging to the false promise of salvation. They honestly believed the local police would roll up, recognize the great construction mogul Marcus, and arrest the rogue daughter for trespassing. I did not move a single muscle. I stood firmly in the center of the patio and let them cling to their pathetic lifeline for 5 full seconds. I let them savor the sweet, fleeting illusion of safety before I completely severed it. "You really think the local police deploy a 12-car tactical convoy for a trespassing dispute?" I asked, my voice gliding over the deafening wail of the approaching sirens. I tilted my head, watching the delusion slowly melt right off my father's face. "The Fulton County Police do not care about family arguments, Marcus. But do you know who cares very deeply about multi-million-dollar tax evasion and interstate wire fraud?" The screech of heavy tires slamming onto the imported cobblestone driveway echoed through the open breezeway of the mansion. Heavy car doors slammed shut in rapid, militant succession. The sound of heavy tactical boots hit the pavement, marching in perfect, terrifying synchronization. "That is the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division," Y informed them smoothly, and they brought the federal inspectors right alongside them. "I filed my forensic audit with the federal prosecutor's office 72 hours ago. The local police are just out there to block the road. The agents storming your front doors right now have a signed federal warrant for asset forfeiture." Cassandra's eyes widened to the size of saucers. She let out a guttural, suffocating gasp. The realization hit her with the force of a freight train. She was not just losing the house, she was losing her freedom. The golden handcuffs she had placed on my father were about to be replaced by cold, heavy steel. "They are here to seize every single bank account." I continued, my voice acting as the calm, professional narrator to their absolute destruction. "Every luxury vehicle parked in that garage. Every piece of stolen jewelry resting on your neck. The 1 hour I just offered you to pack your bags was a courtesy. The federal agents sweeping your living room right now will not even give you 60 seconds. The sound of commanding voices echoed from inside the house. "Federal agents, do not move. Show me your hands." The catering staff who had lingered in the kitchen were being swiftly evacuated. The reality of the raid had officially breached the walls of their fraudulent fortress. Jamal let out a pathetic whimper, dropping to his knees beside his wife. Chloe just stared blankly at the glass patio doors, entirely paralyzed by the sheer terror of impending incarceration. I turned my back on my father and his crumbling legacy. I took slow, deliberate steps toward the grand outdoor dining table. The pristine white tablecloth was still covered in half-empty plates of gourmet food and expensive floral arrangements. I reached out with a steady hand and picked up the crystal champagne flute Cassandra had been holding when she first insulted me. The cold glass felt heavy and perfectly balanced in my grip. I turned back to face the woman who had drugged my mother and stolen her empire. Cassandra was trembling so violently, she could barely keep herself upright. She was hyperventilating, staring at the approaching shadows of federal agents moving rapidly through her opulent living room. I raised the crystal flute, catching the late afternoon sunlight in the bubbling golden liquid. "Happy Mother's Day, Cassandra," I said. My voice was crisp, lethal, and laced with absolute triumph. I took a slow, elegant sip of the expensive champagne. The vintage was crisp and perfectly chilled. I lowered the glass and offered her one final, devastating smile. "I hope you look good in prison orange." I set the crystal flute down on the stone table with a sharp, definitive clink. I did not wait for her response. I did not need to hear her beg or scream or try to bargain with the federal agents who were now pushing open the glass patio doors. The execution was complete. The debt had been fully collected. I turned my back on the wreckage of my family and walked away. The camera perspective followed me from behind, tracking my steady, confident strides as I moved across the patio and stepped through the threshold into the lavishly decorated living room. Federal agents in dark tactical gear were moving swiftly through the mansion, slapping bright seizure notices onto expensive paintings and cataloging the imported furniture. Two agents brushed right past me, their hands resting securely on their utility belts, moving aggressively toward the patio to place Cassandra and Chloe in handcuffs. They did not stop me. They did not question my presence. The lead investigator caught my eye and offered a brief, respectful nod of acknowledgement. They knew exactly who I was. I was the architect of the raid that had handed them the biggest financial bust of their fiscal year. I pushed open the massive mahogany double front doors and stepped out into the warm Georgia air. The driveway was a chaotic sea of flashing red and blue lights. Black federal SUVs were parked at aggressive angles across the manicured lawn, tearing up the perfect landscaping. Officers were barking orders over police radios, securing the perimeter of the sprawling estate. Waiting for me, just beyond the police barricade, completely untouched by the surrounding chaos, was a sleek black chauffeur-driven Maybach. The driver, a professional man in a dark suit, immediately stepped out and opened the rear passenger door for me. He offered a polite, deferential bow of his head as I approached. I did not look back at the mansion. I did not look back at the flashing lights, the shattered illusion of the Buckhead elite, or the family that had tried to erase my existence. I simply stepped into the luxurious, quiet interior of the vehicle. The heavy armored door closed behind me with a solid, satisfying thud, instantly cutting out the noise of the sirens and the screaming. I settled into the plush leather seat, smoothed the pristine fabric of my navy suit, and poured myself a glass of sparkling water from the chilled console. I watched through the dark tinted glass as the car glided smoothly away from the curb, leaving the ruins of their lives far behind in the rearview mirror. I had walked into that house as a discarded, grieving daughter. I drove away as an absolute conqueror.